Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the launch event for Flourishing Together, addressing our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. My name is Steve Dalton. I'm the head librarian at Boston College's Theology and Ministry Library, and for the past year or so, it's been my great privilege to serve with some pretty wonderful people on the Flourishing Together planning team. We have a very tight agenda today, limited time, but an ambitious agenda. But I would like to take just a moment to talk a little bit about how Flourishing Together came to be. In the summer of 2024, I was considering options for the fall exhibit at the Theology Ministry Library, and a friend, Steve Cote, who's seated right here, recommended creating an exhibit to respond to then Surgeon General Vivek Murthy's recent advisory in 2023 titled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation. I had heard of the advisory but had never read it, and when I finally did, it really opened my eyes to a serious and pervasive problem. And it's a problem that has, I think, profound implications for all of us here at Boston College. The advisory explained that loneliness does not discriminate. People of all ages, ethnicities, and backgrounds are vulnerable. So casting that in Boston College terms, faculty, staff, and students can be subject to experience loneliness. Considering the size of our campus population at any one time, there could be hundreds and possibly even thousands of lonely and suffering people right here at BC, whether we know it or not. It became quickly apparent to me that the topic of loneliness was too big and too important for the TML to tackle it alone. So I began reaching out to colleagues across campus, first within the BC libraries, and then to numerous other departments. What I discovered, and what was almost breathtakingly encouraging, was the tsunami of goodwill and generosity that I received in return. We are here this morning, and at the Flourishing Together programs we'll be offering over the course of this week, because the good people of Boston College take seriously the charge to be men and women for others. With that in mind, but before we get started on the formal program, I'd like to just offer a few moments of gratitude. First, I would like to thank our sponsor for Flourishing Together, BC's Institute for the Liberal Arts. We were funded by ILA's major grant program, and we also received terrific logistical support from the Center for Centers. Bravo, I know some of the staff are here from there. Bravo, without your help, none of this would be possible. Thanks are also due to our co-sponsors, my department, the BC Libraries, and BC's Krall School of Theology and Ministry, which is the school that my library is charged to serve. From the heart, to all sponsors, thank you. There are too many generous individuals to name them all, but I would like to mention two people in a special way. Father James Keenan and his Jesuit Institute team embraced the Flourishing Together theme and offered 3 pre-events, 2 in the spring and 1 in the fall, to build momentum for this week. The events were wonderful, and I could not be more grateful. I must also mention the director of BC's Women's Center, and I'm sorry I'm embarrassing you if I am, Katie Dalton, she's here somewhere. I was diagnosed with prostate cancer at the end of March, had surgery in June, and it was crunch time for this event. And Katie volunteered to take up my duties essentially while I was gone. Other people helped, but she did planning throughout my medical leave, produced lots of posters for people to use, and did a better job than I ever could have. So again, Katie, I could not be more grateful. Let me touch quickly on what will unfold here today and this week. We'll begin with a much anticipated keynote address from Dr. Robert Waldinger, whom I will invite to the podium in just a moment. Following Dr. Waldinger's presentation, he will interact with all of you during a roughly 15-minute Q&A session, which we will be recording. And for that reason, we ask if you have a question to wait for someone to come to you with a handheld microphone. Following the Q&A, we'll have roughly a 2-minute stretch break at your place while our panel members take their seats on stage, and each panelist will then present about loneliness and/or its remedies based on their respective research and experience. Since our panelists' bios are all available online, and since they each have only 15 minutes to speak, I will not provide lengthy introductions. Instead, I will offer only these brief words. Our first panelist, Dr. Alyssa Goldman, joins us from BC's Sociology Department to address the topic, the social context of social isolation and loneliness. Our second panelist, the Reverend Dr. Christopher Krall, S.J., joins us from Creighton University, a sister Jesuit school, and his topic will be religiosity and loneliness. Our third panelist, Dr. Christina Matz from BC's School of Social Work, will address the topic risk factors, resilience, and the role of meaningful engagement in mid and later life. And our final panelist, mental health counselor Samuel Aston from BC's Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics, will conclude our formal program with his presentation titled The Being of Loneliness. And let's begin. Dr. Robert Waldinger is professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and directs the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of adult life ever done. The study tracked the lives of 724 men for over 85 years and now studies their children to understand how childhood experience reaches across decades to affect health and well-being in adulthood. His TED Talk about lessons learned from the Harvard study has more than 50 million views, and I think I'm only responsible for 18 or 19 of them, making it one of the 10 most viewed TED Talks of all time. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Waldinger.
Okay. Well, it's an honor to be here. And, I have a long history with BC. We, as researchers, have collaborated with faculty at Boston College. We've had wonderful interns who are BC students. I live just down the street in Newton. I've lived here for 40 years, so this feels like a very familiar and friendly place. So as you heard, I've been directing this study that's been going now for 87 years. And it's a study often described as a study of happiness. 30 years ago, nobody who was a serious scientist would have said that they study happiness because it wasn't considered a legitimate area of inquiry. We assumed that if we were getting richer as a society, that we were getting happier. And then somebody decided to look. And what they discovered was that as societies grow more wealthy, as GDP goes up, happiness either flatlines or it goes down. And so at that point, people began to wonder, what is this? Happiness is certainly separate from wealth. And many of you probably are familiar with the World Happiness Report that the United Nations sponsors, where they send scientists and researchers all over the world to ask people, what are the ingredients of a good life for you? And they do this every year. You can download the enormous PDF each year that will give you statistics on every country in the world. And what they find is kind of remarkable, which is that everywhere, all over the world, people describe the same basic elements as necessary to have a good life. And so we're talking men, women, young people, older people, people from all ethnicities and cultures. So what do they say? Well, they do say that wealth is important, but not wealth in the way the word connotes. It's really having your basic needs met. And when we study that, we know that once we get our basic needs met, we reach a level of happiness that's far greater than if we have food insecurity, or we're afraid of not having health care, or being able to educate our children. So in that sense, until we get our basic needs met, wealth matters enormously. But then beyond that, researchers have done a lot of study of this, and they find that, you could make $75,000 a year, and that's what the average is for getting your needs met in this country these days. But you could make $75 million a year and not be substantially happier. And so what we know is that seeking happiness by achieving wealth doesn't work. So what are the things that people say that they need in order to have a good life? Well, they're things that won't surprise you. So social support, being able to expect to have a healthy life, including access to health care, freedom to make big life choices, and we know that that matters hugely, and it varies tremendously depending on where we live in the world, and even now where we live in the country. One interesting thing is that people describe generosity as essential to feeling like they have a good life. And that doesn't mean just generosity with money. It means generosity with time, with effort, with expertise. And finally, people feel that they need trust. They need to be able to trust their neighbors, and they need to be able to trust their governments. Again, something under threat in many places in the world now. All right, so given that these are the things that show up every year on the UN Happiness Report, what do young people in their early 20s, say that they're going to prioritize in order to make sure they have a good life? Well, when they have asked this question, there was a survey in 2017, over 80% of 20-somethings said that to have a good life, they needed to get rich. Not just have their needs met, but really get rich. Over half of those same young adults said that they needed to become famous, which, if you think about it, is a really strange goal. And also half said they needed to push really hard and accomplish a great deal at work. Again, none of these things show up on the World Happiness Report list of what makes people feel that life is good and meaningful. So what's responsible for the disconnect? And here, it has a lot to do with the kind of cultural haze that we all exist in which really we're bombarded with messages about what a good life is supposed to be, what it's supposed to look like. So, for example, we get messages in advertising and everywhere we look about, if you buy this car, you'll be really happy. If you serve this brand of pasta to your family dinners will be blissful. If you buy a certain face cream, you won't look old, and maybe you'll never get old, right? And it sounds ludicrous as I say it, but think about what we see all day, every day, on our phones, on television, in films. Social media has undoubtedly fueled this, although it didn't begin there. So I pulled this photo from Facebook. It's one of the typical photos that we post for each other about, people having fun. And if you think about it, if you were coming from outer space and your only source of information about human beings was social media, you would think we were always on beautiful beaches, or we were about to eat magnificent plates of food, or at wild parties. And this leads to what one of my teachers once said, which is that we're always comparing our insides to other people's outsides. That, I'm always comparing the me who some mornings wakes up feeling great with the me who some mornings wakes up feeling grouchy or like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. And I compare that to these curated lives that we are shown that look perfect and make it look like everybody's got life figured out except me. All right, so I'm starting to make a case for why we have spent 87 years and millions of dollars in taxpayer funds trying to study what actually happens to people as they go through their lives. So first, why would you study people longitudinally? Why would you spend 87 years studying the same families? Well, over 95% of the research that's done on human life is done asking people to remember the past, self-report about the past. And that's a perfectly reasonable way to collect information, except as you know, our memories are full of holes. What did you have for dinner a year ago today? You have no idea, of course. And that's a good thing. Our brains couldn't hold all the information that we are exposed to. But one of the things we know from good cognitive science is that the very act of calling up a memory changes it. And so we know that not only do we remember incompletely, but we remember falsely. Not with complete falseness, right? But there's a lot of difficulty in just relying on self-report retrospection. The other thing that researchers often do when they want to study, say, the course of an illness over the lifespan, excuse me, is that they use what's called a snapshot approach. So if I wanted to study even loneliness over the lifespan or depression over the lifespan, I could take a group of 10-year-olds today and a group of 20-year-olds today and 40-year-olds, 60-year-olds. And it's a much faster way to study what happens over time, except that it can lead us to make really false assumptions. The best way to explain this is a joke made by Claude Pepper, who was senator from the state of Florida. Senator Pepper said, "When I look at South Florida, I would have to believe that you are born Cuban and you die Jewish." He was using the snapshot approach. And as you can see, if you do this with your research data, you can go very far astray, okay? So again, I'm trying to explain why we've done this for so long. All right. The Harvard study of adult development, as you heard, is probably the longest study of the same families of any depth that's ever been done. And it began as two studies that didn't know about each other. They were both started on the Harvard University campus. The first group was a group of Harvard College sophomores who were chosen by their deans from the classes of 1939 to 1942, 268 of them who were thought to be fine specimens, and they were going to be a study of normal development from adolescence to young adulthood. So of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white guys from Harvard. I mean, this is the most politically incorrect sample you could possibly have. We're constantly having to explain to NIH why it's still worth funding us. The other group, started at Harvard Law School, was a group of boys from Boston's poorest neighborhoods, but also from the most troubled families. Families known for domestic violence, severe parental mental illness, physical illness, known to social service agencies. And this was started at Harvard Law School out of an interest in juvenile delinquency, and specifically how some children from really disadvantaged backgrounds managed to stay on good developmental paths. And so the group that we have studied, 468 of them and their families, started out as boys from terribly disadvantaged families, but who were not in trouble. Now, the what we've done is we have expanded the study to spouses of the first generation and then eventually to children, over 2,000 of the children, most of whom are baby boomers. But the biggest limitation of our study is that it's all white. And it comes from the fact that Harvard was virtually all white in 1939, and the city of Boston was 97.4% white in 1938. The waves of migration of people of color didn't come to this city until after World War II. So for that reason, we know we have a sample that is skewed, but every sample is skewed. So what we take care to do is we will only present findings that have been corroborated in more diverse groups. And if they haven't been, I'll flag that. So there's probably one I'm going to tell you about today that I will flag that's not been corroborated in non-white Western populations. Okay, so when we began the study, these young men, teenagers, were given elaborate medical exams, psychiatric exams. Workers went to their homes and interviewed their families, sometimes their grandparents as well as their parents, and there were elaborate notes about discipline style in the home and what was being served for dinner, in 1939, and what the curtains looked like on the windows. And then all of these young men grew up and went into many different walks of life. The Harvard men were of an age to go to World War II, and almost all did. The inner city men were, on average, 9 years younger, and so they were not eligible for World War II. But all of these men were followed by our researchers, and they became doctors and bricklayers and factory workers and lawyers. John F. Kennedy was one of the Harvard group, as was Ben Bradley, who was the longtime editor of the Washington Post. The Boston Strangler was part of the inner city group, but most of these people were not famous, they were not infamous, they were just living their lives. And that's what's important about this study. These were not special people in any particular sense. They were just folks and families living their lives. And then eventually we began to study aging and retirement. Now, of the 724 original couples, almost all have died. Only about 10 people are still alive. They're all over age 100. We're still in touch with them. But their children are all baby boomers, and we are collecting data on them. So what have we studied? Well, the big domains of life, year after year: mental health, physical health, the World War II experiences for the Harvard men, work life, relationships, and eventually aging and retirement. And then how have we studied? Well, we've certainly sent people questionnaires. We've asked them to remember the past 1 to 2 years, not the past decade. Medical exams, we got their records from their doctors every 5 years. We went to their homes about every 10 years and sat down and talked to them for 4 or 5 hours and about their life. And then as new methods came online to study well-being, we drew blood for DNA and messenger RNA. We put people into the MRI scanner, actually with the help of BC faculty member Elizabeth Kensinger, and looked at how people's brains lit up when we showed them happy images and sad images. All of these ways of trying to get different views of this thing we call flourishing, this thing we call well-being. And so what did we find? Well, one thing we found won't surprise you. It was that if you take care of your body like you're going to need it for 100 years, it just may last that long. That people who really took care of their health in terms of healthcare, exercise, diet, not misusing drugs or alcohol, not smoking, those people lived many years longer than the people who did not take care of themselves. That wasn't a surprise. That information was already starting to be out there in the world. What was a surprise that we at first didn't believe was that the people who lived the longest, stayed the happiest, but also stayed the healthiest, were the people who were most connected to other people, who literally saw more people in a given week, and who had warmer relationships with other people. So we didn't believe this at first because, we know that the mind and the body are connected, but how could relationships actually get into your body and change your physiology? How could that possibly be a thing? And then other studies began to find the same thing, and we began to understand that this finding is quite robust over many populations and samples. And then we began to work on understanding how it actually works. So first, we know that loneliness, which we are all here to talk about today, is as powerful a risk factor for poor health as smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day over many years, as having untreated high blood pressure, as being obese, that intimacy actually keeps us alive. A lot of these studies on married people show that married men live significantly longer. Married women also, somewhat shorter, but still longer. Women will always tell you that marriage is a better deal for men than women. But first of all, this is not just marriage. This is being in a partnership. The marriage license isn't the active ingredient here. But also, we think that the reason why women don't get as much of a benefit is what we call a ceiling effect in research, that women are more connected generally than men in their lives. So that the difference for men is far greater to be in an intimate partnership than it is for women, who are better at maintaining networks of friendships. The other thing we know from good research on aging, a lot of this comes from Rush Medical School and also from University of Chicago, is that people with broader social networks as they age, and people who are more socially active, have later onset of cognitive decline, if they're going to get cognitive decline at all. And if they do get cognitive decline, that happens more slowly than it does for people who are more isolated. So all that is to say, really good things come of social connection. And as we know, there is an epidemic of loneliness, certainly in the developed world, but all over the world. A recent Gallup poll asked people on the street at random, did you feel lonely yesterday? Which is a very interesting, powerful question. And 1 in 4 adults said they were lonely a lot of the day before they were asked. The loneliest age groups, I would have thought it would be older people, but it's not. It's the people who are most prevalent on this campus. It's people under age 30. About 30% of people under the age of 30 are estimated to be lonely. And low-income households. And that probably has to do with people struggling with hardship, people struggling to work too many jobs to make ends meet, and having very little time for social engagement. All right. So how does this work? Because that's the big question. If we know how relationships get into our body, we can have more faith that this finding is real and we can explain it. So the best hypothesis we have for how relationships keep us healthy and how loneliness breaks down the body has to do with stress. So we're all subject to stress, and something stressful happens to you, and the body goes into the fight or flight response, and that's normal. Heart rate goes up, we breathe more quickly, we start to sweat. That's not a problem. The body is meant to go back to equilibrium when the threat is removed. But what we think happens with people who are socially isolated is that we know social isolation and loneliness are stressors. The body, we evolved to be in groups, and so we subliminally know that we are in more danger when we are alone. And there are lots of studies demonstrating this. And what seems to happen then is that lonely people and isolated people seem to have a kind of low-level fight or flight response going on all the time, that they don't ever go back to that equilibrium physiologically. And then what that does is puts out more stress hormones like cortisol circulating all the time throughout the body. It results in decreased immune function, so we're more susceptible to infectious diseases, and chronic inflammation. And these are the ways we think that loneliness and chronic stress can gradually break down multiple body systems. That's how, for example, that some people who are lonely and chronically stressed can be more likely to develop type 2 diabetes, while other people would be more likely to develop heart disease or arthritis because of these broader mechanisms. Okay. Now, when you study things over time, you get to ask the same questions over and over again, which can really annoy your study participants, but it's very powerful data. So we asked about relationship satisfaction, and we asked the same questions 8 times over 50 years. And so we could make a little graph for each couple we asked about, but you can see this is a schematic of all the couples, and that, when we're happiest with our partners when we first get together. And then if a couple has children, marital satisfaction goes down when the first child is born. It goes up again when the last child leaves home. And it only goes down again if kids come back to live at home. This is true. And now, let me say, this is the finding that is common to the white Western developed world, okay, particularly in the US, that there are many families, many cultures where it's the norm to live at home, not to leave home to go to university at all, but to stay home, to stay home even through marriage. So this one you need to take with a grain of salt. About this is specific to, to people like me. Now the other thing that we find when we study relationships is that they don't have to be smooth all the time. You could imagine from what I'm saying here is that you can't have any conflict with the people in your life. And of course, that's impossible. But what we did was, at one point, we brought couples into our laboratory and we had them have an argument with each other. It's a standard research technique. And we would ask them, so think of a topic that you two normally argue about. It could be money or sex or time with friends or childcare. And then pick one and argue with each other while we videotape you. And the couples quickly forgot about the videotape, the video cameras, and they were just off to the races with their argument. And then what we did was we had researchers come in and watch each videotaped argument. And we asked them to rate the expression of emotion between the couple. And what we wanted to know was, did the amount of anger, for example, in the couple predict who was going to be together and happy 5 years later? And we followed them up 5 years later. And it turned out that it wasn't how angry couples got at all. It was the determinants of who stayed together and who stayed happy. It was whether you could see affection and respect within the couple, even while they were having an argument. The amount of anger didn't really matter that much. And that seemed important. And it seemed something that was really important to get out there, because we can often imagine that you can't have any conflicts, you can't argue. That's not the case. All right, the other thing we find, because we study people over time, is that we get happier as we get older. The geriatric psychologist Laura Carstensen at Stanford helped us study in a very rigorous way the development of well-being as people got into their 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. And what we found was that, in fact, we get happier. And many other studies have found this as well, that in fact, it turns out in our midlife, maybe mid-40s, certainly by the time you get to your 50s, you begin to have this creeping sense, I really am going to die. This death thing is real. This is not something that's just going to happen to somebody else, or it's so far in the future I don't have to worry about it. And the increased realization of the fact of death, I would have thought it would have made us more depressed. It turns out it has the opposite effect, that it enhances a sense of well-being because we prioritize well-being. that question, if not now, when, comes up much, much more as we get older. And it makes us make certain changes. So it turns out our brains pay more attention to what's positive as we get older, as opposed to younger adults. Our brains are riveted on what's negative. That's why, negative clickbait is so riveting. But as older adults, we pay more attention to the positive. We remember our past more positively. We actually whitewash our memories a little bit as we get older. There's a bumper sticker I like. It's never too late to have a happy childhood. And this is what happens, as we get older. We get choosier about how we spend our time. So as we get older, those meetings that we never really enjoyed, we kind of just stop going to them. And some of those friends or, who we always spent a holiday with or we always had to see out of obligation, we just kind of let those relationships go a little bit. And so you see a small trimming of our social networks as we get older as a way to make ourselves happier. And we savor the present moment a lot more. We do stop and smell the roses much more in our various ways of doing that. So another thing we study is how people spend their discretionary income. With all this talk about wealth, so how does wealth make us happier? Well, when we have extra money, the question is, are we happier when we spend money on material things? Or are we happier when we spend money on experiences? Experiences like, tickets to an athletic match or tickets to a museum or a concert or a family vacation. And it turns out, as you can imagine, that the best things in life are not things. That we are happier and we're happier for longer when we spend our discretionary income on experiences. So then the question is, why? How does that work? Why? Well, it turns out that material objects just beg for comparison. So if I buy a new flat screen TV and I bring it home and I'm really excited because it's so big, and then I go to my neighbor's house and she's got a bigger flat screen TV, like comparison, Teddy Roosevelt said, comparison is the thief of joy. And we know that when we compare ourselves to others more frequently during a given day, we are less happy. And the people who do less of that are more content. And also, of course, when we pay for experiences, we usually do that with other people. We bring a friend or family members, or we meet new people. This is a family vacation we took, and these were people we had never met before who turned out to be lovely lifeboat mates. All right, so all of this, again, is telling you about the benefits of human connection, and I'm going to bring you back to what we know is the bad news in our culture right now. Bowling Alone comes from a famous book, some of you may know about it, published in the 1980s by Robert Putnam, political scientist, who studied what he called social capital. How much do we invest in other people? And what he found was that there were dramatic decreases in social capital in how much we had people over, we joined clubs, we volunteered, we had family dinners. And that when he asked people in the early 2000s, do you have anybody you can confide in? 1 in 4 people said there was nobody on the planet they could talk to about personal matters. And so we know that this isolation is increasing. Loneliness at work is a big problem. The Gallup organization studied 15 million workers a few years ago, asking, do you have a best friend at work? And those with the best friend at work were better at their work, better at their jobs. They were happier at their jobs. They were less likely to leave their jobs. But only 3 in 10 people said they had a friend at work. And of those 70% of people who said they didn't have a friend at work, only 1 in 12 reported being engaged in their jobs. Most people were pretty checked out. So all of this has tremendous effects, even on the bottom line of our productivity. So our closest relationships are really easy to neglect, probably more so now because of the digital revolution, that we are more and more on our phones, and we are more disconnected from the natural world because we're on our phones. This is a famous photo published in the New York Times. So the question is, how do we lean into relationships? What do we do about this if these are the trends in our world? Well, here I'm going to turn to one of my Zen teachers, John Tarrant, who said this. He said, "Attention is the most basic form of love." Attention is the most basic form of love. And if you think about it, our undivided attention is the greatest gift we have to give each other. It's also the most difficult thing to give each other now because we are constantly distracted by these screens. So one of the things we have to think about is, how do we become more conscious of giving this gift we have to give to each other, day after day, moment after moment? So there are ways to work on this, right? We can work on our ongoing relationships by really structuring time alone with each other. This is a date night. My wife and I used to have date nights when our kids were little because otherwise we would never speak to each other. Family dinners. We know family dinners are hugely impactful. Eating together as a family, hugely impactful for child development, for family cohesion. Workplaces can be constructed, can be structured so that the culture is one of collaboration, is of friendship development, rather than isolation and competition. And of course, volunteering in the community is hugely impactful for well-being. So there are ways to do this. We can make strengthening work connections a priority. In this institution, this is part of what you're doing today. We can create time and space for collaboration and have people learn about each other's personal lives. Rather than being a distraction, this is the glue that holds people together in any organization. But my take-home messages before we get to some Q&A are that human connection is a major source, not just of happiness, but of physical health. That technology has the power to isolate or connect us. Also, our political leaders have the power to isolate or connect us. And so what I would say is that we can make choices every moment to turn toward the voices that make us feel more open toward each other, and turn away from those voices that make us feel more disconnected. And finally, we need to really actively structure our lives at work and at home, because the path of least resistance is social isolation, but we can counter that with increased social connection by explicitly focusing on it and working on it. So thank you for your attention, and I'd love to hear some questions, some comments, whatever you've got to say. You're going to have people in there? Okay.
Hello. Thank you so much, Dr. Waldinger.
Wait.
I'm right here.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Sorry.
Just a voice from the,
Yeah,
from
it
the
was like,
clouds.
whoa.
My name is Karina. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. A lot of your presentation and your research focuses on the presence of close ties and their impact on our health, but I'm curious if your research has shown the importance of weak ties, because I know feeling a sense of connection to your neighborhood or your greater community is really important. And so I'm wondering if your research shows any of that correlation as well.
Well, I'm really glad you mentioned that, because these, they're called weak ties in the research literature, but it's really casual ties. Like, the people you sort of know in your neighborhood, but not well, or the person who checks you out in the supermarket, who you see week after week, that kind of thing. And my research has not studied that explicitly, but there's good research showing that those ties are very important. It seems that when when you talk to an Uber driver, anything like this, we get little hits of well-being and a little sense of belonging to a larger community. So I'm really glad you raised that. Some people are more inclined to talk to strangers than others, but we know that it actually makes us happier to talk to strangers. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm wondering if you have any early results from the youngest generation in terms of parental distraction because of digital media.
Our results aren't great because the younger generation are baby boomers. So they're nowhere near digital natives, right? They didn't grow up with screens. They grew up with television, but they are more likely to watch television. They're more likely to, they use Facebook a lot. So there is some, but there isn't the social media use that we see in younger generations. So I can't report on that from my research, but I think, as you probably know, there's a lot of good research now on the younger generations, and it differs literally by 5-year periods because, so for example, my sons are in their mid-30s. They're not digital natives. And so their relationship to screens is very different from my nieces and nephews who are in their mid-20s. And so all of this is, there's more and more good research on this. It's just not from my study.
The question of spiritual life didn't seem to be raised in what you were saying?
It was. So my predecessor, George Valiant, was particularly interested, and he asked people more than once, do you have a religious practice or do you consider yourself spiritual? About half of our participants said that they did have kind of a religion, spirituality orientation, and about half said no. And what we did an analysis of happiness and longevity, and there weren't really differences. But again, these were just 724 families, so that's relatively small. There is research, for example, by Tyler Vanderweel's group, the Human Flourishing Project, and his work suggests that there is an advantage in health and longevity to having a religious or a spiritual practice. The data are kind of, they're hard to parse because it's very difficult to separate out religion and spirituality from social activity, because one of the biggest incentives for people to connect with each other is, to participate in religious activities, in churches, synagogues, mosques, is the social connection. So it's very difficult to separate those two out when we study them. I think that's why the data aren't so easy to draw conclusions from.
Hi, I have a question. I'm way back here.
Hi.
Hi. I have a question about social anxiety, which
Yeah.
is very, very common in people in their 20s and younger, and that seems to be a big impediment to social connection. So how do you have any research either from your study or from other studies about how does social anxiety factor into that, and sort of what can you do about that?
Well, it does factor in. It's a really important topic you're raising. We know there are good treatments for social anxiety, as you probably know. A lot of good, like cognitive behavior therapy, and a lot of good treatments. So one thing is to get people help, because there really is, people can get a lot better. The other thing is that we know that, now, introversion is not the same as social anxiety by any means. And there are introverts who are not anxious at all. They just don't like being with a lot of people. What we know is that it's really important for each person to determine for themselves, how many people do I need in my life? And am I a party person or not? And that there's nothing wrong with being an introvert or an extrovert. They're just very different. But so it doesn't, that gets beyond your question about social anxiety, but it's really meant to speak to the fact that individual differences are huge in this, including individual differences in how much social connection feels right to us.
Hi, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your research.
Yeah.
I had a question about online engagement. You mentioned how social media can actually cause people to be more lonely, but are there any types of online engagement like Zoom communities or anything like
Yes.
that you've
Yes,
seen that
yes.
actually can build connection with others?
Absolutely, absolutely. It's easy to say, the internet is bad, social media is bad, but it turns out, and there's good research on this now, that a lot depends on how we use the digital world. That actually Jean Twenge's work is pretty good on this, that there's this idea of passive consumption where we just consume other people's Instagram feeds, and that way of using the internet usually makes people feel more depressed, more anxious, lowers our self-esteem. But, as you're suggesting, if you actively use the internet to find a community of people, maybe who have a particular condition that you have but nobody around you has, or maybe some other way that you share something with people in an online community and you don't have people around you who share that, can be enormously helpful for our well-being. So again, it's the kind of takeaway is active consumption of the digital world versus passive consumption. Active can be pretty good. Passive seems to have a bad effect on us.
Hello. Hi, doctor. Thank you so much for being here. This might relate slightly to the last question, but there has been a huge influx in the use of artificial intelligence by individuals, especially young people. We've even seen examples of people using artificial intelligence as confidants, and even some cases of people falling in love with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, how do you see this affecting the loneliness epidemic? Do you see this as a potential positive for society, or are there drawbacks with this?
Oh boy, that's such a good question. I'm remembering the movie Her. I don't know if you ever saw that movie. Oh my gosh. Well, again, because this is all so new and research is slow, probably there's going to be important research to come out in the coming years that will give us better answers. I think one of the things, but I've been surprised by the things that we can do in the digital world that I never thought we could do. So for example, I'm a psychotherapist as part of my role as a psychiatrist. If you had told me before the pandemic that you could do meaningful psychotherapy on Zoom, I would have said you were crazy. It works. And so I'm thinking about, they've done some studies with using chat bots with older adults who are lonely, particularly in care facilities. And they find that it really helps them, right? So, but what about a young person who might use this as a substitute for going out and making relationships in the real world? That seems like a bad bargain. So I think, again, that the point is that we're going to find out more about which uses of AI and which uses of these bots can actually be helpful for people and which really harm us. So it's a long way of saying, I don't know. Yeah. Okay, one more question.
I got one question right here. So So I'm Steve, BC class of 05. And it's getting up there. I'm starting to think the way you were talking about, getting older. But
it gets better.
My question, when I was in college, I was often thinking about where I wanted to live, how big I wanted my house to be, whether I wanted to be in the suburbs or the city or what part of the country. And I'm wondering what the study says about where people live, what environments they're in, what their built environment they're in, and like what to think about in terms of this question of loneliness and social connection in terms of where you choose to, what you choose to be around in the built environment.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. All of our folks started out as city folks. I mean, there were a few of the Harvard undergrads who came from more rural places all over the country, but even those folks, and certainly the inner city boys, were all city kids. So most of them have ended up in cities or smaller cities more than, I don't think anybody became a farmer, for example. So we never studied that because we didn't have the variability in occupation to do any meaningful work on that. I bet there's work out there. It's not part of what we've studied. All right. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much to Stephen Dalton for organizing this and for inviting me to be a part of this event. Our keynote talk by Dr. Waldinger just focused on the importance and consequences of social ties and the myriad ways that social ties influence quality of life and other outcomes. My brief talk is going to highlight the social context of social isolation and loneliness, focusing on some of what we know about when we experience social isolation and loneliness and how these experiences are distributed across the population within the context of the US. So first, I want to spend a moment distinguishing between social isolation and loneliness. We often talk about these concepts together. The recent US Surgeon General's report that we just heard about is titled Our Epidemic of Loneliness and Isolation, and it is true that these concepts are somewhat related to each other. They both describe aspects of our social lives that carry important consequences for health and well-being. However, they are also different in important ways that are also relevant for how we think about addressing issues of social well-being. So loneliness generally refers to a perceived deficiency or mismatch between actual and desired social relationships. In this sense, loneliness is subjective. It is an evaluation we make of our social lives. Social isolation, on the other hand, refers to this objective state of having few social relationships or infrequent social interaction. This is often measured in quantities, like asking people in surveys, how many friends do you have? How often do you talk to people in your social networks? How many people do you live with? And so on and so forth. So one important direction that has gained traction in the research on the social context of social life is this notion that being socially isolated or being lonely are not exclusively static traits that describe us all the time. So while some people certainly tend to be lonelier than others, some people tend to be more socially isolated than others, or have larger social networks, more friends, more social engagements than others. These are dimensions of social life that can also fluctuate over time and sometimes over very short periods of time, like within a given day. So research studies have used techniques like smartphones or smartwatches or other means of collecting data from people as they go about their daily lives. And this illustrates that we really can feel lonely one moment and not lonely a few hours later. And likewise, we can be alone one moment, which would be a relatively momentary state of social isolation, but then in the company of others at another point later in the day. And so this raises questions for us about how these fluctuations suggest that we need to understand loneliness and social isolation, not just as characteristics of individuals overall, but what are the social contexts when we do tend to feel lonelier than others, or when we do tend to be more socially isolated, and consider how these fluctuations have implications for addressing this epidemic of loneliness and isolation. So one thing we've learned through using this more fine-grained, nuanced approach to studying these momentary fluctuations in isolation is that even these fluctuations in whether we're alone or with someone at a given point in day do have effects on our daily well-being. So these are some results from a study I was a part of looking at 300 older adults living in Chicago who were given smartphones, asked to carry them around for a period of 3 weeks. They were pinged 5 times randomly during the day and asked to answer various questions about who they were with, where they were, how they were feeling. And my colleague and I found that when these individuals reported being with someone else at some point during their day, they reported feeling less fatigue and less stress in that particular moment compared to when they were alone. And these results emerged even when we accounted for measures of their overall health and well-being, as well as their overall social connectedness. So this was regardless of how big or small their general social connections and patterns of social activity engagement were. In another study using the same sample of older adults in Chicago, we looked at how lonely people feel in a given moment of the day. We found that men experience higher levels of momentary loneliness than women, and that these fluctuations in daily loneliness were surprisingly not really patterned by individuals' overall social network size in ways that we might have expected. So in this study, respondents were asked to name up to 5 people with whom they confide in or discuss matters of personal importance. So the largest network that someone in this study could have would be 5. And we found that even among people who named 5 individuals who are considered to have relatively larger social networks, they still experience comparable levels of loneliness throughout their daily lives compared to those who had smaller networks. So not only do social isolation and loneliness vary throughout the day, but their variation is not necessarily predicted by or related to general or overall patterns of social connections that tend to be how these social qualities are measured in many surveys. So some other insights we've learned from studying daily fluctuations in loneliness suggest that, at least among this older adult US-based sample, feelings of loneliness are lower when people are in locations outside of their own homes, are outside, are with people as opposed to when they're alone, specifically when they interact with friends and families as opposed to interacting with other people they meet throughout their daily routines, and when they're engaging in more positive social interactions compared to interactions that can feel like a source of stress or tension. So these findings highlight the importance of everyday environments and interpersonal moments. But when we talk about the social context of loneliness and social isolation, we aren't only focused on where we are or who we're with and the spaces we move through, we are also concerned with the broader social structures beyond individual moments. So zooming out here, and I'm borrowing this conceptual diagram from Drew Meehan and colleagues in their review of the socio-ecological factors that shape loneliness, we can consider that in order to really fully understand the social context of loneliness and social isolation, it's critical that we recognize their unequal distribution. Social connection is shaped by socioeconomic factors like income and education, where we live, including characteristics of our neighborhoods and local communities, as well as systems of exclusion and marginalization in society more broadly, such as racism, ageism, ableism, and more. And age and life course transitions are also critical, which will be covered by some other panelists in subsequent presentations today. So while it's important to understand what makes people feel less lonely in the moment, we also need to consider these broader social structures that affect who has access to social connection and means of mitigating feelings of loneliness. So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to highlight some of the research in these areas, beginning with what we know about socioeconomic factors and who is most at risk for social isolation and loneliness. So for one, we tend to see that education is protective against loneliness and social isolation, as is higher income and having higher prestige occupations. So the graphs I've included here also demonstrate that when we look at participation in organized social activities and volunteering, we see a clear pattern that higher educational attainment is associated with more frequent engagement in these activities, as is social network size. Religious service attendance is somewhat of an exception here. And these linkages between socioeconomic status and loneliness and social connection may be driven by mechanisms such as poorer health, higher stress, and having fewer material resources that can increase vulnerability to loneliness, along with limited time to access social activities. There's also growing and extensive and growing research that characteristics of where we live shape our access to social ties and our experiences of loneliness. So living in neighborhoods that are more socioeconomically disadvantaged and more segregated tend to be associated with higher levels of loneliness among their residents. Other features of the built and social environment, such as walkability, green spaces, access to transportation, and even just having positive assessments of the social cohesion, trust, and community, tend to protect against loneliness. With respect to social connections, we also know that living in neighborhoods with higher levels of disadvantage is associated with experiencing higher rates of losing ties with family members in particular over time. So aspects of the communities where we live play an important role in helping us to build social ties and also maintain social ties and protect against losing or dissolving those social relationships. Systems of exclusion and marginalization also play a major role in shaping loneliness. So research shows that experiences of everyday personal discrimination are strongly associated with greater loneliness, especially among people with lower levels of education. So why might that be? One hypothesis is that discrimination creates a sense of alienation and threatens belongingness in society, which heightens loneliness. There is also an important spatial dimension here. So for example, in other research using the Chicago older adult sample, Black older adults reported greater loneliness outside of the home compared to white older adults. And the authors of this article speculated that this may reflect experiences of exclusion and discrimination in public spaces, which makes environments outside of the home feel less safe or welcoming. And this all connects to a bigger picture. So systems of exclusion don't just operate interpersonally, they're embedded in political and social structural conditions. There's a lot more work to be done in this space. As I illustrate in this diagram here, more research is really needed to fully understand how these macro level factors, like the political and social structural conditions in which we live, as well as policy and social change, influence loneliness and social isolation, but also how these factors condition or shape everyday lived experiences of different groups in ways that could also intersect with the links between social isolation, loneliness, and health that we heard about in the prior presentation. So a few key takeaways that I'd like to conclude with. First, recognizing that loneliness and social isolation are not static. They fluctuate over time, and they can fluctuate over very short periods of time. Second, these experiences are not evenly distributed. Some groups face much higher risks because of structural and social factors. And finally, effective interventions can't just target individuals. They need to address the broader community and social contexts. This includes access to resources, opportunities, stress exposures, and whether people feel a sense of belonging and inclusion in their everyday lives. So if we want to reduce loneliness and isolation, we need research, policy, and practice that tackle these systemic drivers, not just symptoms. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. My name is Father Chris Krall. I am a Jesuit priest. I hope you'll welcome me from the far-off missionary territory of Omaha, Nebraska. So yeah, I'm kind of the oddball out being out of BC, but actually I do have a lot of BC connections, being an undergrad and a theology student graduate from this fine institution. So even though I'm wearing the Blue Jays and not the Eagles anymore, I doing some missionary work out there. But I guess what I'm hoping to do is kind of fill in some of the gaps that Dr. Waldinger had kind of mentioned. And so the question that was brought up about religiosity, or like, does faith have an aspect of it? And then focusing in specifically on young people, as that's what the institutions that I'm working at Creighton, but what we're here at Boston College. And so how does this loneliness pandemic affect specifically young people? And does a sense of engagement with religiosity have any effect on that, or a mitigating factor to that? Just maybe before diving into the problem, in some ways a lot of this work seems to be, and maybe this is just me of getting into things, but it's like a lot of this is like, duh. I was almost going to call like the title of my dissertation this. It was just like, is this really news? It turns out we need to be in a relationship to be happy. Like, whoa, I mean, this is a radical concept. Like, where did you get this idea? Or, I mean, but so we'll kind of work into it, but in some ways, what are some of the factors that we're doing as a society that seems to be going so against this common sense of like what we need to do to like be flourishing and happy? And so as a group we're able to get some internal funding at Creighton University too, to do this project called Life Together. seeking what makes us whole. And we just wanted to see, like, how do we stand in terms of loneliness on the college campus, in terms of young people today, like a college population, and then are there any mitigating factors to this, especially in our kind of basic demographic of generally a religious institution that is a liberal arts school that engages it. So we have a little bit smaller campus than Boston College. We're at about 4,300, and we just tried to put out this like total undergraduate survey on loneliness. Turns out we actually got over 1,286 student participants. It helped that we were able to get our funding to distribute gift certificates to Grubhub, and so we kind of had to get them some food. But we were kind of actually recognizing when we were doing this that it turns out that are we actually like training the students to be even more isolated and not go to the cafeteria by doing this survey? And it's like, ooh, shoot, now it's like they're scrolling, filling out our survey on loneliness, sitting alone, eating their Grubhub. But the idea of like just where do they stand, but actually, so 30% in a response rate was actually like remarkable. And so, but we had to feed the students. So here's what actually we're trying to do in the implementation of it. And so there are these general like quantitative, qualitative like analysis. The UCLA loneliness scale is probably one of the most famous of how to actually engage in or measure this aspect of loneliness. Now, it is still all a self-reporting, and so they're experiencing this, and we're just asking them to use, as Robert Waldinger said, is improper, but their memories or their experiences or just their engagement. But the idea of like, we have to start somewhere. But we're also trying to get some like correlations with some of the other aspects of their life. Patient health questionnaire, the PQH, that's kind of a well-known aspect of depression. The overall anxiety severity as well, this OASIS, this simply the sense of well-being questionnaire, a cope mechanism, like how do you do to cope? That's kind of just a few questions on coping mechanisms. And then here's where we get into these different religious practices and beliefs, and then the spiritual religiosity and this well-being scale. So we're trying to like just get all of these questions. It took about 15 to 25 minutes on the outside for them to take, but just kind of going through and getting some basics like demographics, what type of students that they are, but then how they answer each of these different kind of questions. And here's some of the basic results. So in average, like the average UCLA loneliness score was about 44, college-age students in general, more of a 48. And here Creighton is kind of falling maybe slightly below that. We really try to build ourselves with a Creighton family, and you join we're all Blue Jays. I don't know if Blue Jays all migrated, but anyways, we as Blue Jays, we do like kind of gather together. We have these like big marches through our mall, our main campus and things, and have a lot of things to really gather us together. And we like enhance it as a student body that we are big families. But is it really making that big of a difference? And we're paying this much money and to do all these things and to have this kind of environment, but we're pretty average in terms of where students are falling in terms of loneliness. And it's like, is that good or not? And so that's kind of where we are. And here's some of just like the other correlations that we started. And so this loneliness was positively, and again, this is where the dull comes back into it. Belonging and uncertainty, like loneliness was positively associated with the sense of like that, like if they don't necessarily, they're uncertain if they do belong here, well, yeah, they're going to have higher levels of feelings of loneliness. Higher depression, yeah, it's going to correlate with higher loneliness, it seems. Anxiety, too, even then this sense of avoiding, and it's one of the coping mechanisms. If they do that, well, yeah, they may seem more lonely. But it was negatively associated with then social fit. If they feel like, yeah, I'm a part of things, I do all the clubs. I think most university campuses have kind of like this club fest of any kind. We call it, we have a building called the SCUT Student Union, and so the SCUT shutdown, where like every club on campus goes, and all the students have this opportunity. You get flooded by 150 emails the next day from all the different clubs you just signed up for, and you're completely overwhelmed. But this sense of like, do I fit, and do I belong here? And so the sense then of positive relationships will seem like, yes, I have less loneliness if I have positive relationships. Self-acceptance, even the sense of mastery, and mastery is more of like this an environmental sense of belonging, or I feel this is like, I have a sense of this environment, simply what Steve Cote was asking early on, what is the sense of environment? So some basic correlations here. Here's where then the religiosity comes in, where the loneliness scores were then lower for religious and spiritual students and more and down to the 40. And so it's like these are, like statistically relevant kind of lower statistics, and higher for those who are feeling unsure, agnostic, or even reportedly atheistic. And this belonging uncertainty at Creighton scores were then lower for religious and spiritual students statistically, and social fit at Creighton. But there's some complexity here too. I mean, the people who have chosen to come to a Catholic religious school, it's like, well, they're choosing their population who they want to be with, and those you find. So we're starting to see some, it's like, it's not just like, okay, I just fit, or people who practice religion, you're not going to be lonely. Well, careful here. Like, the environment certainly does make a difference. And as you can see these big statistics, those who reported being religious and spiritual are the far majority of students at a Catholic Jesuit school. It's kind of, that makes sense. That's why they would go there. There's a lot of state schools that you could go to that if you didn't want that. But, so it's that sense of environment, and can we, as an institution, even as a Catholic institution, help to make people feel more welcome, and how does that even look? For those students who self-identified as religious or spiritual, this was positively related to and having the sense of social fit, loneliness, belonging, and uncertainty at Creighton. Some changes there. But there is something to that, and I think Dr. Waldinger was kind of hinting at that, with a sense of those who do seem to practice religious elements, does that allow them to engage with communities? And in some ways, is that even the point? And so there's some colleagues of mine in our theology department. We're going to do some of more of the theological exploration of this. If we even look back at some of Pope Francis's encyclicals, he started with Laudato Si, an environmental encyclical, but at the same point, it's very much an encyclical about that we are all part of this common home. And then he moved to, I say with my students, tutti frutti, fratelli tutti, that it's like we're all part of these, we're brothers and sisters, we're all part of this great community. And so much of the encyclicals of Pope Francis was trying to work against this pandemic of loneliness that he saw as such an issue. And so the idea of being religious, practicing religion, whether it be a Christian or others, is that we want to have this sense of membership and engagement. And in the Christian religion, is it about ultimately their greatest desire is to join all the angels and saints in this great kingdom community with our God, who in God's self is very a triune nature, communal and social in God's very self. And so is there something very theologically and deep about this, but in terms of self-acceptance, how we as human beings simply act and interact with each other, is there something important about having these relationships? But is that, again, kind of that common sense, the duh factor of all this? And so, religious well-being was associated with some like coping styles as well, problem-focused and emotion-focused kind of things. So, I can kind of scroll through some of the statistics. But here's where some of the demographic groups that seem to be more marginalized, and especially in a Jesuit Catholic institution, and they felt more lonelier if they associate themselves with the LGBT, the poor, even they're not Christians, even like lower GPA. Much of like all of our institutions, kind of the type A driven, going to medical school, seeking graduate schools right from the start. And so those who don't seem to fit in, all of a sudden, like, I don't have a sense of belonging here. I don't think I'm good enough. And the whole shame factor starts coming into this. So just a couple things. And how important, like, higher education. So I guess this is where we as institutions, especially maybe the Jesuit network across the country, can start thinking about, like, what can we do to help mitigate this pandemic, and especially in this younger generation? And we can immediately like look at, oh, it's the cell phones, it's killing us and things. Well, maybe, but it's like, how do we help to create these environments that are much more engaging for even those marginalized populations that don't seem that sense of belonging in these kind of environmental situations? And what does that actually look like? Well, I mean, we can start to think, and I think some of the next speakers are going to be talking more about remedies to this, but these close encounters in the third space, and how do we build these places? And if you build it, will they gather? But there's still something missing, and maybe this is going to be kind of like more of a kind of concluding aspect, but I recently had an experience. I'm a Jesuit priest, but also a reserve naval chaplain, and I had this opportunity, for good or for bad, to have this deployment. And I was just, in the last 9 months, I've been in Djibouti, Africa. And so I've had to kind of like more of a social experiment, kind of and interacting with some of the people on deployment and just hearing, are you experiencing loneliness here in Djibouti? You're separated from family, you're thrown in this distant country, you're away from all these kind of like comforts, it's 150 degrees and you're like sweating to death. But the idea is like, one of the living situations that we had, we called clues, or compartmentalized living units. And it's basically the back of a tractor trailer truck. They cut that in half, and you have at least 2 people on each of those halves. They line up about 100 of those and stack them 4 to 5 high, and you have like 1 bathroom in the midst of all of those. And so you're sharing your bathroom with your closest 150 friends, with like 4 sinks, and 2 of them are broken, and then kind of 3.5 showers. Many of them are like wide open and messy and things. And so that's the living. And I even went to like the camp psychologist on deployment. It's like, are you dealing with loneliness issues here? And it's like, certainly we have stress, certainly we have trauma, certainly we have separation things, but really not a lot of loneliness. We have to share a big galley, like 5,000 people come to the galley or cafeteria of sorts. And then it's a bunch of teams. People like are working on their widgets, adjusting widgets on this $5 billion machine over here, or this other big airplane there, whatever these people are doing on their deployments. But in some ways, it's very much a sense of teamwork, camaraderie. We do things together, we live together, we're bumping shoulders with each other. And so a sense of loneliness, really not an issue. And so then we kind of question, well, how do we sell the university? Well, we take our students around this beautiful campus, and all the grass is manicured, and then we show them these wonderfully new residence halls, and here's your private room here, your private bathroom here, and kind of you'll never have to see any of your neighbors down the hallway, and you'll be happy here. And then you can do Grubhub or Take and Go kind of things, and you can take all your food back to your privatized place, and then you can just sit alone and scroll on your instant media, and then you'll be happy. So this is, I guess, where the duh is coming back. It's like, we know it, and we want to have connections, but in some ways, we're only doing it for force. It's like we're going to be sent to a third world country and forced to living in these clues. Then we can have actually a healthier life. But when we want to have things other ways, or when we can build things in more luxury, are we actually killing ourselves? So I guess it comes back to this: is it so common, but the common sense maybe isn't that common after all? And so how do we rebuild a stronger, happier, healthier social community? Thank you very much.
Right, good morning. My name is Christina Matz. I'm an associate professor at Boston College in the School of Social Work and director of the Center on Aging and Work. It's great to be here this morning. You know, there's been some wonderful presentations pointing out some really important things in this conversation around loneliness. You know, Father Krall talked about young adulthood, and I'm going to kind of have us think a little bit more broadly across the lifespan. But loneliness impacts really people of all ages, right? And there's been a tendency, I think, historically to kind of talk about older adults as, you know, particularly lonely, and to think about it as a loneliness of an issue amongst older adults. And then more recently, there's been a lot more attention to younger adults feeling lonely. However, this is really an issue that impacts people of all ages. There's been different studies that have found that, for instance, this particular study that I'm highlighting here finds that loneliness peaks in young adulthood, again in midlife, and then again in later life. And so it really depends on how you measure it, how you approach it. I'd like to encourage us to think about it as an issue for all ages. With one caveat, because of the aging of our population, we're really seeing huge numbers of older adults who are experiencing loneliness. So between 2020 and 2050, we're expecting the number of lonely adults age 50 and older to triple because of population aging primarily. But there really are different risk factors that happen, over the course of the lifespan that tend to have an impact on loneliness. For instance, when we think about children and adolescents, bullying really is an important factor in affecting the extent to which people feel lonely. Social exclusion, transition, school moves, and that type of thing. Young adults dealing with identity formation, and a lot of what Father Krall talked about was trying to find your place in this world and your identity, and that's a big struggle for this period of life. Unstable housing, work, digital comparisons, as Dr. Waldinger talked about. And then in midlife, there's caregiving burden, marital breakdown, job loss. Those are all really related to the onset of loneliness. And then in later life, bereavement, other role losses, health decline, living alone, mobility limitations, those types of things. So there certainly are key life course events that happen that tend to affect the extent to which people feel lonely. But I also thought it was really important to talk about how common loneliness is as an experience, right? And so Dr. Goldman talked about this. But, kind of when you think about who is lonely, the short answer is all of us at times, right? And throughout our lives, feelings of loneliness will arise with regularity. And most people experience loneliness as a transient event, as maybe an episode. And so there's this study that's been done looking at those age 50 and older that found that 40% of older adults, when looked at longitudinally, have experienced at least one episode of loneliness. And there's a much smaller proportion of the population that experience chronic loneliness. And so you're more likely to see people moving into and out of episodes of loneliness as around different things that are going on in their lives. There's a few quotes here that I thought were kind of impactful around like what loneliness feels like. Loneliness is this quiet ache that no one talks about, so kind of referring to shame around loneliness. It slips into your life quietly. It's this shadow that settles beside you, right? And so I think oftentimes from a life course perspective, there's various events and transitions that might occur that kind of where loneliness can slip in and really unexpectedly. And so there's also a body of literature that has recently kind of emerged that really focuses on the role of transitions in creating the risk of loneliness. And as a gerontologist, I've been very interested in aging because we're aging since birth, right? And a lot of what aging is, and as a gerontologist, is really thinking about how do we help people move through the different seasons of life, right? And aging to me is fundamentally about transitions. And whether it's a new job, moving, joining the military, losing a friend, retirement, health changes, shifts in family or work identity, whether they are a micro kind of transition or more of a macro transition that involves the shifting of one's identity and or loss, transitions are hard, right? And oftentimes can be lonely. So Hegstead talks about lonely transitions and what types of transitions are particularly lonely. And so life events or transitions that are relatively uncommon among one's peers can be considered a particularly lonely transition because you have no kind of shared social support or reference points, those that are you feel kind of more alone in that transition. So something like widowhood or divorce or might be one of those transitions that can feel particularly lonely because you don't have a lot of reference points and kind of social others that you might know who have experienced something similar. Whereas other transitions that are more normalized, or you know a lot of people who have gone through that transition, that can always also be lonely, but maybe a less so, or more, you're able to connect with more people around that. So this to me speaks to the importance of finding these shared, these communities of shared experience. And technology and social media can really do that, right? Where you can find these communities online where you can have a shared experience and feel less alone in those types of lonely transitions you might be going through. So what transitions predict the onset of loneliness in individuals age 50 or older? We know that widowhood is one very, very strong predictor of loneliness in later life, but also divorce, ceasing co-residence, and then there's a weaker relationship around exit from employment and chronic health conditions. Becoming a grandparent is typically a positive a protector against loneliness. But it's interesting to kind of look at these predictors of an onset of a loneliness episode. So what are some of the protective factors that we can think about? What does the evidence say is a protective factor? Well, first of all, many of the presentations refer to the quality of relationships that matter, not just the number, but also, per one of the comments earlier, Dr. Karen Fingerman's work really talks about the importance not only of connecting through close, intimate ties, right? Attachment, belonging, supportive others that are very close to you, but also this idea of consequential strangers. So it's the people that, you know, the woman that you see at the coffee shop every morning. It's the mailman who stops by every afternoon, right? And it's these people who you see on a regular basis that you aren't necessarily intimately close with, but they provide that sense of structure. They provide that kind of social capital and feeling like you're part of some community. People know you, right? That can be really important. And so her work really touches on the importance of that. Also, we've touched on we connect through these, you know, weak and strong ties, but also we connect through a sense of purpose and place and community, right? And so a lot of my work at the Center on Aging and Work focuses on meaningful activity engagement. Like we call it engaged aging. So engagement in paid or unpaid activities, including but not limited to work, volunteerism, informal helping in your community, civic engagement, hobbies. It's all of these types of roles can support a sense of meaning and purpose in later life. They've been found to support health and well-being as we age, to prevent age-related loss, and to prevent age-related functional decline and cognitive decline. And what we really see is that relationship has a mutually beneficial, is mutually beneficial, right? So participation kind of engenders positive health and well-being, and that positive health and well-being engenders continued participation as you age. And research has also shown that activities that carry personal meaning or confer a sense of purpose have stronger health promoting effects than those that don't. So, you know, there's this kind of ethic of like stay busy and retirement kind of thing. And it's not so much just staying busy, but it's really engaging in things that are meaningful to you. And so this is kind of the model that we use at the center to of how we can think about how the quality and nature of the activities that we engage in affect health and well-being and the mechanisms through which that works. And it's really through the structure that they provide on a day-to-day basis to move your body and to be more socially connected and or more cognitively engaged. So, couple research findings just to demonstrate these points. Colleagues and I looked not that long ago longitudinally at some data and found that because widowhood is such a huge risk factor for loneliness, we were really interested in looking at widowhood. And so after someone becomes a widow, their loneliness really skyrockets, right? But we found that those who started engaging in 2 hours or more of volunteering per week during the same wave that they became widowed, their loneliness scores returned to that comparable to their married peers. And so it really kind of was very much a protective factor in preventing or buffering loneliness after widowhood. So it was very interesting. Other protective factors, community programs, being part of a community, and intergenerational initiatives is extremely important. We know from the literature on intergenerational activities that those who engage intergenerationally have more positive attitudes about their own aging as they get older, and it really oftentimes is very satisfying, supportive relationships, and so it can be hugely protective when it comes to loneliness and health and well-being as we age. And then technology has come up multiple times today, really important piece of the puzzle here, and I think we've referred to this idea several times already with Dr. Waldinger and others, this kind of technology paradox. And so I did a study with colleagues a few years back looking at midlife and older adults and their use of mobile phones, and found that older adults who were using mobile phones for sociability, it actually reduced their loneliness, right? And it facilitated more in-person interactions, right? It was kind of a facilitator of getting together, right? And those who used it just to pass time actually increased loneliness. So it's really not about the device, but how it's used, as was already mentioned. But this is just a study to support that. So just in closing, Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, has this quote, creating a connected life begins with the decisions we make in our day-to-day lives. Do we choose time for people? Do we show up as our true selves, right? And I just wanted to close by sharing a health promotion program that my team and I developed and tested through a randomized controlled trial, really asking people to step back and thinking about their activity portfolios and what they might do to kind of shape the things that they do on a day-to-day basis to be more health promoting. So we asked them to think about this compass, the 4 points of engagement. And one of the activities that we led them through was to ask them to think about what are the things that you engage in on a regular basis, weekly, right? And to kind of list those out and think about how many hours a week do they do these things? And does this activity require me to be physically active? Does it require me to move my body, get out of the house? Does this activity challenge me to think in new and complex ways, cognitively stimulate me? Does this activity involve social interaction? Is it a positive social interaction? And how meaningful is this activity to you? Does it enrich or deplete you? Does it connect to a passion of yours? And then from there, to ask yourself, how might I alter my activity portfolio to either enhance certain activities so that they are more social, they are more cognitively stimulating, they are more directly connected to things that are meaningful to me. So I will wrap up there and say, if loneliness is one epidemic of our time, meaningful connection is one of the most powerful vaccines. So thank you.
My presentation is going to be a little different, and if I'm difficult to follow, nothing I say is particularly unique, so just refer back to the experts. Experts who I want to thank for making my job very easy, or at least very fun, because it is in their attention to detail that they've left me a little bit of room to be more abstract and obscure and dramatic in my approach. I'm sorry. Yeah, so I plan on speaking on a philosophical and psychological experience of loneliness in relation to our modern world, but again, I'm going to make you work for it, so please forgive me. A few weeks ago, I was a part of a conference here held at BC called Psychology and the Other. It's all about putting psychology in dialogue and therefore in tension with and resolution with other disciplines that are not innately in alignment with each other. While what an impossible word that is, other. So vague, so filled with meanings, a literal holding of all that is not me. Me and the other. I am othered. Must I be alone from you? It is said that Adam and Eve hid when they first gained the knowledge to perceive themselves. A naked other is not, could not be worthy of being in a radiant presence, and so they hid. Why, though, does this othering, this separation, bother us so? Why do I hide away in shame, knowing that I cannot be known, knowing that I am just some excess of the world? After all, I was the one who was tricked. How was I to know that eating from that tree would cause me to see the world as it always already was, that I was never at the center of its attention or completion or being, that I always lacked in its presence, that the best I can do is to give up a part of myself to fit within its form, within the form others desired me to be in, with the illusion shattered, I desire and I need to get that sense of connection and completion back. Yet it is in that desire to fix what is wrong with me that I find my shame and where I feel my isolation. The shame of admitting to being broken and at fault. The isolation of just hiding away. It is also, though, in time, where I will begin to seek connection. For just as perception divides us, it grants us the opportunity to rekindle a bond lost in the face of our othering, but made possible in our mutual sacrifice and desire to be and have and recognize each other. With the other, in friendship, community, and in love, we are faced with our responsibility to be there for them. Each of us kindling with but starting embers in us in the windy night, hoping to make it to sun's rise. We huddle together so we might survive, but even here a return to the perfect union is impossible. There is no return to perception, to the sun at its zenith. We are instead met with something else, an ongoing, an unfurling dance of the embers in the wind, sparking and being snuffed out in our kindling. How could there ever, of course, be a true reunion? For you are you and I am I. To lose sight of that fact would be to lose sight of the tension in our dance. No, our realities clash and challenge each other, for they cannot both be true. Yet it is in this movement that we see sparks of resolution and realize we are each other's only hope. There is tension and resolution in our dynamic. Will you burn me? Will I burn you? Or will we keep each other warm? And so we meet, we dialogue, we must converse, ever hopefully getting closer, but never quite meeting. This is not a failing of what it means to be human. This is what it means to be human. To be in tension is to be human. To sacrifice and strive, to burn and forgive, and to repeat it all. These make us human. These allow us to grow out of our shame, out of our isolation, to fall in love and be in community. What a lovely way to sort of say nothing, though. Who cares? We all know people get lonely. Other people get unlonely too. There have always been lonely people. There always will be lonely people. So who cares? Why care now? What has so changed in the world that loneliness of all things deserves our attention? For goodness sake, just go outside and talk to someone. What's so hard about that? It has been said that each cultural and artistic revolution is founded on an earlier technological revolution. In his work, Constructing the Self and Constructing America, Philip Cushman lays out how America's success in World War II and the subsequent technological boom led to the deconstruction of long-standing communities, replaced by an explosion of individualistic consumption, forming what he called an empty self, a self that is never satiated, that always seeks to consume. And then at the start of the new millennium, Cushman revealed that to continue propping up this cycle, the self has been forced to split into multiple selves, for thinned pieces of us act as the perfect form to fulfill hyper-individualized, commercialized aspects of our lives. The work self, the school self, the shopping self, the with my yoga friend group self, right? At each of these stages, Cushman is describing a new structural shift in how we have relationships and what it means to be in relation. So why care now? Because we have once again found ourselves in a new era, the era of the digital self. How we relate to the world, to each other, and to ourselves has changed, and it is continued to follow the trend Cushman laid out. Now more than ever before, it is easier to only be a portion of ourselves, separated from the world, stuck in consumption. Now in the digital age, I spiral into a fragment of myself, into my very own hyper-individualistic fantasy. One in which I remain at the center of digital being, one where I determine the content I consume as it warps itself to my liking. Like the Ouroboros, I consume and regurgitate and repeat the spiral, always fleeing away from the interactions that threaten the world I have built for myself, that threaten to bring me back to my shame and reveal to myself how deep my isolation goes. No, Instead, I will simply return the ticket of our shared reality and stay within mine. It is far too scary out there in the windy night, not knowing when the sun will rise, if I will see another kindling with embers. Much safer to stay here and not risk it. And when my illusion is close to shattering, and I will ensure I will be just stimulated enough to think never of the windy night right outside my darkened room as I scroll my phone once more. At least books and newspapers and television had a resolution and a shared cultural moment, a moment of harmony where something coming together could resolve, where tension between you and I could resolve, where we could experience catharsis. Now there is no resolution. The instant boredom hits, I have scrolled beyond it in an endless loop. The only moment I am faced with the realness of my situation are the brief moments my screen loads where I am faced with bloodshot eyes. The moment my walls are close to blowing down, I am already digging deeper and deeper into myself and into my room and my algorithm to avoid it. A corporate algorithm is a rejection, I think, of our responsibility in the face of the other. It invites us to become more self-focused at the expense of our ability to relate and deal with the shame and tension. It leads us to believe that we are engaging with others, but even in its most realistic, it is but a simulacrum of community, because it will never be in dialogue with us. Interestingly enough, it is in this inability to deal with these factors, this running away from and self-consumption that we now all engage with, that actually grows the discontent we experience. For we mistake the purpose of tension and shame and loneliness. They are not experiences to be avoided as we want to. They are our physical body's signs to us that what is happening is not okay and must be resolved. Just as the body's expression of hunger is not one of don't eat food, right? It is one that we must satiate ourselves. When we ignore the call from the body, we create a feedback loop, expanding the spiral of shame until it consumes us and isolates us further. I want to be clear, though. I'm not shaming or lessering other online dynamics and relationships fundamentally. Many people, particularly minority and norm-divergent individuals, are able to find deep and meaningful connections to others and to form communities that would have been otherwise impossible. There is still a way forward here for us in this digital age with our digital selves, because we, I can assure you, are not going back to a time where we all had to be muted, cookie-cutter versions and socially acceptable versions of ourselves. What I am bemoaning is the corporate growth-driven algorithmic and, in time, AI-centered change that has fundamentally altered the way and structure of relationships, away from being with other people, away from our responsibility to each other, away from the sacrifices we take on that make it all worthwhile, and towards selfish, nihilistic consumption of whatever content will keep me just content enough. I bemoan that my relationships and communications center on me and my infantile desires and not on the possibility of us. That as a society, it is easier to turn away from each other than it is to invite the other into our lives. Because where are you to go where is one to go if you want to join a community? If you go outside, there is no one to talk to. Where are the public places to convene in our America? Everyone is on their phones, myself included, in their own world, or has somewhere to be via car where they must optimize and produce. I'm expected to always be on, always consuming myself to see what else I can produce on my own or with others in a regimented, specified, allowed space. We have replaced each other as humans with equivalent monetary expenditures that provide us the excuse not to engage. We are given the excuse not to engage, and so we do not. We have become prisoners to our shame and no longer have an excuse to reach past it. We are not, in this time, unique in our relationship to shame. We are unique in our ability to bypass it entirely. Where once we were forced to huddle in the windy night, be it out of survival or at least boredom, now I just need to stay in my darkened room, as you do in yours, in our own worlds. Yet, even still, it is painfully obvious that we cannot all survive this ever-growing feedback loop. We are threatening to burn ourselves down to ash. Lonely people are crying out for community. All people are crying out for community, even though our places of community have been taken away from us, privatized in the name of efficiency, even though in many ways we have structurally forgotten how to have community, how to sacrifice in the name of something bigger. So now it is the time for action. The structure we find ourselves in is not natural. It is built out of human decision. It is built out of human desires and intention. There are structural and legal changes that we can enact for us to have the desired outpouring of human connection. Human connection is not actually mystical. All we need is to allow it to be intentional and allow the space to grow. In our digital world, we have prioritized streamlined logical functioning and cut away anything that makes it human and act surprised it does not grow. Humans require places where people may simply be people instead of products or thinned bits of themselves, particularly places that lack monetized purpose, that do not rush us through to the next thing we are supposed to do, just so we can sustain the loop a little bit longer and avoid ourselves a little bit more. The creation of third places, like public parks and libraries, human-oriented policy changes instead of short-sighted consumer-oriented policy. We have within us the potential to do great good as well as great negligence, and we hold on to now. Last thought here. Now, especially now, people of the world and of America are in need. Let us recognize the need for deep structural change and societal change. Let us recognize the other's face and allow them to recognize ours. Let us recognize our responsibility. Let us risk burning, and let us sacrifice so that we may be with our neighbors, for we are in need too. And let us go to them and huddle close this windy night until the rosy dawn breaks through.